All right. Hey, guys, it's Brett. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really happy to be joined by Joshua Center, whose new book, Heaven on Earth, comes out on Monday, the 15th from Rubric Press. I always have to watch because I don't know where I'm doing if everything's reversed. So, Joshua, thank you so much for being here with me today.
It's
I was
good to be here.
wondering, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind, in regards to the book, just giving all of our viewers out there a chance to know what it's about.
It's basically it's a story about a woman who she and her husband have started a mega church in South Carolina, and then she finds out that he's been having an affair with a male prostitute, and the news media finds out about it. It blows up their entire world, and she and her husband, Sam, her name is Ruth, and his name is Sam. They take their children and they flee to Sam's parents' farm in Missouri. And when they get there, we meet Sam's parents and we begin to sort of understand where he came from. And his parents are diehard Pentecostal Christians. And over the course of the book, Ruth is sort of questioning, like, should I stay in my marriage or should I not? And we're sort of wondering, like, wow, should she stay in her marriage? Should she not? And the journey that she goes on is sort of a journey that I took because I came from a very super evangelical background. And I came out to California and became a writer. And I started reflecting on, my experience. And then, like, what do I believe and why do I believe the things that I believe? And what happens when you say, hey, maybe those things that I used to believe in and that supported me are no longer necessary. Is that good? Is that bad? But this is a story about a woman who's sort of going on that journey, and the idea of heaven and earth. What is real heaven and what is earth, and what is why are we here, and what makes it worth it? So that's the sort of long and the short.
Yeah, no. And it's, I have to say, like, I almost was going to ask you to, and you did it. So thank you. Talk a little bit about your own biography, because I knew that you grew up in Missouri. So, and I wondered how much of this actually influenced you in terms of this religious aspect, because your first book as well is also set in Missouri, a very different, in some ways, very different kind of book. And yet I think it also deals with these themes of moving forward and progress, and thinking about things in the past, and also what is coming next. But
yeah, I like to write sort of what I've experienced, and for me, it's like a sort of psychological. It's like going to therapy to sit and, like, write another character going on the journey that I've gone on, and I can sort of be like, oh yeah, now they're going to make this mistake, and I remember when I made that mistake, and now they're going to figure out this, and I remember when I figured out that, and the sort of glories and the tragedies of what, and really what it is to be, I do write a lot about the Midwest, and I like to write about it because that was my home for 20 years. And it's sort of, they call it the heartland, and it's the middle of America, and it just feels like I don't feel like there's a lot of stories that are told about it. And I really love being able to create sort of humanity there, and sort of, especially for people on the coast and anybody else who's like, what is that? What is the Midwest? You can read one of my books and you're entertained, and you're also like, oh, now I understand. That's the reason that these people are thinking the way that they're thinking, or they're behaving the way that they're behaving. There's a psychology behind that. And that's what, so the books are me sort of dealing with my own sort of coming to grips with and understanding my past and where I've come from.
So this is fascinating to me too, because when you were coming up with the idea for this book, or you started to brew this around, did you always know that you wanted to take it through Ruth's perspective? Because, I mean, it seems like someone could have written this, and certainly written this book from Sam's perspective, being raised in that family and so on and so forth. I mean, I loved her, and I loved watching her journey. and she's so well written and so layered. And I kept thinking, what made you make the decision to follow it was her that the journey would be through?
I just felt like, Sam, uh, gosh, it's interesting. So the real story about heaven and earth, this is fascinating. I mean, I think it's kind of fascinating. So used to write, or I used to write on the show Desperate Housewives.
Mm-hmm.
And before that, I did a show called The L Word, and I have four sisters that I grew up with. And I feel like I've always sort of been able to capture the sort of female voice really well. And I've had so many people just tell me, like, you just capture this so well. So first of all, it's just something that I'm very comfortable sort of telling a story from the female perspective. But then secondly, I had originally written this as a pilot for television.
Oh, wow.
And I actually, yeah, and it was optioned. It's been optioned twice by Warner Brothers, one time by Dan Lin and one time by another producer who I'm forgetting. And they were very, people have been very excited about this story and these characters. And in the pilot that I wrote, it was much more of a ensemble. But as I decided to take this, and what happens is, you sell these pilots or you get them optioned, and then they don't move forward for whatever reason, and you have to move on to other projects. And this one was just one that I'm like, gosh, the story, I just wanted to tell the rest of the story, because the pilot is just sort of like the first couple of chapters of the book.
Yeah,
And I'm
yeah.
like, but I knew where it was all going to go. And I knew where these characters, like how they could exist. And so it sort of ate at me until I was like, I'm just going to write it as a book. And especially with the success of Still the Night Call, my last book, I thought, let's do it. And so I wrote this out. And as I was writing it, I really wanted to give the perspective of myself, of somebody who has come from a religious background and then realizes, like, maybe I don't believe those things anymore. And I felt like Ruth was that character. So she was, for me, the right voice. And then being so comfortable writing women, it just seemed like the right thing to do.
I felt like for me, and I loved your first book, but this one had such a um, personal resonance because I also was raised in a very religious background, not Pentecostal, but I went to a church camp in the summer, and
Yeah.
there were so many um, parts of this book that I recognized. I even remember when I went to college, going to church with a group of my friends, and at the time struggling with my sexuality, coming to terms with that, and going to a charismatic church in Pittsburgh. And I remember that first time being in there and people were speaking in tongues, and that the emotional kind of rush that came through. So all of that stuff and these people, uh, I want to say frighteningly real. And I don't mean that in a negative necessarily, but those people became um, so they resonated so much with me in terms of even these points of view, and it's so timely with so much of everything that's happening in the country right now, which is another thing which I think both of your books have are so fantastic with, is they are addressing things that uh, we're looking at every single day in this country. And I think one of the things that people had been talking about in relation to this book, when I went on to Goodreads last night and I was looking around, is the kind of fall of the mega pastor
Yeah.
and these sex scandals from everyone from, you know, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker to Ted Haggard to as recently as, Jerry Falwell Jr. and the whole Liberty
Yeah.
University scandal. And so again, you're hitting on such a timely thing, but also something that feels um, there's this hypocrisy that exists among so much of this. And that I found fascinating as well.
Well, and I think that that's the hard thing. And that's what sort of Ruth is like, dealing with. And that's what I wanted to deal with in this book was, and her mother, in this book, who's just one of my
Lawrence.
favorite characters. She she just keeps calling it like she sees it. Her mother represents like total hedonism, like she's a complete atheist, like, and then here's Ruth, and she's like, I don't subscribe to that belief. And that makes me like, and she almost rebels, and that's how she becomes like this super sort of Christian. But then there's this sort of middle ground, which is where you have to exist in order to not go crazy, in order to be a human being. It's that place in between heaven and earth that where humanity, where we find our humanity. You know, we get told all the time, like the crazies on the right and the crazies on the left. And I think the majority of people are all in the middle, and we
I
just want
agree.
to like be, alive and human and not be judged this way or that way. And
Yes.
so that my writing is, it's about, sort of Ruth sort of finding that in herself. And she's, but I show both sides. And I think that it is, as I was in the middle of writing this book, the whole thing with Jerry Falwell Jr. happened. And then, we've got this election coming up, and I just feel like, wow, this is so, like, I didn't mean for it to be so timely, but it's so timely because if you read it, you begin to go like, okay, now I understand why people are having reactions over here and over here. And anyway.
Absolutely. And I think that that was what the big thing, that was what surprised me so much, even on with Still the Night Call, because it humanized a whole section of the country that, but it didn't do it in a way that felt preachy or felt like anything was pounding over the head with anything. You really, you empathized with this guy and you really understood and you really were like, okay, I get it. I completely get it. Much more than, what we're getting through a newscast or what you're getting from anything that's coming down like that. That's all about sound bites and the most sensational things that are possible. And I absolutely agree with you. I think, and it's one of the things I remember even in conversations having with my own family in regards to, being gay, it was always about, most people don't live in these extremes. Most people, like
Yeah.
you said, are in the gray in the middle and just trying to get through. And they're more concerned about how are we going to pay our bills and feed our kids and those kind of things than they are about all these, drag shows and all the
Yeah.
extraneous bullshit that's getting pulled up.
That's what my goal as a writer. Tennessee Williams says, there's a quote by him that's like, nothing human disgusts me unless it's unkind or violent. And
Mm.
I just, from the first time I read that, it was whenever I was in college, I read his biography, and that has stuck with me. And that's how I like to approach all my characters. Unless you are unkind or violent, I don't judge you as a character as I'm writing. I want you to be simply a human. And I, as a writer, want to find out psychologically why you're behaving the way that you're behaving. And, so that's sort of how I approach my writing and these characters. And when you, and that's what I love about when people read my books. A lot of times, most times, people, they get it. They're just like, oh wow, you've like managed to like walk this tightrope. And that's my goal, to not be, I never want to be preachy. I just want to tell a story. And it's kind of like when you read the New Yorker and you're just like, well, what am I supposed to feel? Well, it's just telling you the facts, and then you get to
Right.
decide, like, this is what I feel about this situation. And I really miss that sometimes. I know that there's a lot of editorializing, and a lot of times, especially in the book world, you have to sort of like decide, well, what side are you on if you're going to tell this story? And for me, I'm like, I don't want to pick a side. I just want to tell a really good story.
I have to bring up though, talking about these characters, and as Naomi and Joe, I just had to read this one thing that made me laugh so hard when one of the first times we really see Naomi, where and I'm gonna put on my glasses here so I could actually see what I'm reading. Um, she says it's when they first arrive. And she said, he hasn't said a word to me since y'all got here. Naomi shot in Ruth's direction without looking at her. Clearly, Naomi had seen Ruth's approach out of the corner of her eye, but didn't want to acknowledge her directly until she had something to toss out that would remind Ruth of her current and very low status in Naomi's internal hierarchy of deplorable people. I thought that was so
Yeah.
perfect and burst out laughing, but I was like, she was a great character. And, again, both of those people, I know those people.
Yeah, yeah. And
And
that was taking both of my grandmothers, who I loved for specific reasons, but also terrified me for specific reasons, and sort of combining them. And by the way, if you're a 70-year-old lady and you're living in a small town in Missouri, like, you gotta have some balls on you. Like,
yeah,
you're but that can also be a real, like, that can also be really awful if the sort of like point of view that you just adhered to is sort of kind of awful. You just created this plate that you backed yourself into a corner, and that's where Naomi is. She's sort of backed into this corner that, like, she can't, even I don't think that she could get out of it at this point, because it's defined her religion and her sort of right, way of
mhm,
thinking. It defines her so much. What would she be without it? And that's another thing when we talk about, religion and people. And I saw that so much with my family back home, is just that, like, they can't, like, if you get too defined by your religion, you can't leave it, because then what are you? Because you don't know who you are. And
mhm.
Ruth's journey is finding out who she is in the middle of this tragedy, and we're on that journey with her. And that's scary for, hopefully, the reader, as you're going, like, did she make it? I think that was really important for me, because I think a lot of people were trying to say, like, hey, I'm not going to be defined by this or that. I just want to be defined by who I am. And that's just something that this is a place that we're in for a majority of people. And I wanted to help sort of reflect that and give people a chance when they're reading this book to go, like, oh yeah, I see myself in that character.
No, and I think people absolutely will, and I think people absolutely do. Um, I just think that watching, exactly like you said, watching that journey and watching her try to make these decisions, and the fact is, there's no easy solution to any of it. There's no like,
Yeah.
okay, well, I could just do this or I can just do this. And this is a woman who arguably had an extremely comfortable life. She talks about that at one point, in terms of there was never any financial issues once those things were set up and once they really got going. So to have their entire world blown up in front of them, and for what? um
Well, that, in that last scene with between her and her mother, when she's, we've seen like a couple of moments in Washington D.C. when there's like the gay rally, and she's like, Ruth is like I think she's like a 12-year-old girl, and she's at this, and it's the thing we all know what happened 20-30 years ago. And then you have her back there all these years later, and she's become this very diehard evangelical, and she's speaking at a rally that's, for banning abortion. And her mother is like, I can't believe that you're here doing this. This is insane, and this is awful. And that's another sort of situation that we're in right now in America with the abortion debate. It's become
yeah,
so front and center. And I know that so many women that are Christians, because I know my sisters, my mother, it's so hard for them to go, I need my rights as a woman, but then my religion is telling me this is wrong. And Ruth is in the middle of that journey. And I think that's another thing that in this book becomes very, I hope that that's something that women who are religious, who, believe in God, and they are questioning, like, do I believe that abortion should be free, and women should be able to access safe abortions? Yes. you go on this journey with Ruth, and I think then you can say like, oh yeah, I understand. It's not an easy decision to make, but there is this sort of like when you get to the other side of like realizing what's important, you go, oh yeah, even and that's another big journey for her that I think is important in this book, and that is another thing that we're just sort of dealing with right here in America.
Well, it brings to mind something to me, which I have felt for a long time, again, growing up in the church. But there's a really big difference to me between organized religion and spirituality.
Yes,
And
yes, yes.
it's just a vast world. And that is very much, I think, what her kind of journey is evolving towards. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and I think organized religion, just in my experience, there's a, and clearly it's in the here as well, there's an inherent danger to a lot of it. And only because I feel like, you know, it it's exclusionary. It tells people, and you talk about this in the book as well. It says that this is the way you should be, only this, excluding all these other various
Yeah,
tenets.
possibilities.
So, yeah, I
Well, and
don't
I just want to say, so I've had my own, issues with being a gay man, and like then, having to sort of like want my family to accept me as I am, and realizing like that might not be possible. And I remember sending an email to my mother. It was one of the last emails I sent her before we just sort of like kind of cut off sort of our relationship. And in it, I just said, if you believe in God, or you believe any type of God, whatever if you just believe that there's this God that's infinite, there's these infinite possibilities, this spiritual being of infinite possibility, why wouldn't you believe that the world is not black and white, that the possibilities of
mm,
what we can be and who we are is just infinite? And I never understood that, being somebody who came from that world where it's like, oh, God is a God of infinite possibility. If he is, then that means things are not black and white. Never. They are just
right.
full of color and variation. And that is beautiful. And that to me is also heaven. And also, by the way, that's whenever writing becomes really fun, when your characters can be, they can have a depth, even go back to a show like Desperate Housewives. The reason I think, those characters were so great, those women, is because they were flawed, but they had depth. One minute
Mhm,
you were like,
mhm.
oh my God, I can't believe she did that. And then the next minute you're like, oh, I can totally relate to that. And that was the thing too, is like, we've all had our bad days. We've all had our good days. And I really, that's when people watched Desperate Housewives and they're like, oh, I'm exactly like Susan or whatever. And you're like, I'm exactly like Bree Vandekamp. That is me. But the beautiful thing was, like, it's these characters were constantly being human, and that just goes back to what we've already talked about, which is this idea of like, what is human and what is humanity, and what is it? It's okay to be, to not like have all the answers, and then to not define yourself by the answers that you're told you should have.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So, I know you're going to be busy now going on to this, but what do you have something else in store? Have you started on the next thought, or what are you writing next, or where are you at? I know there's also a writer's strike going on.
Yeah.
That just a little thing. So what's
Yeah,
happening next for you?
I was literally in the middle of rewriting two huge feature films, and then the writer's strike started, and it was like, oh gosh. But luckily, I have another book after Heaven and Earth. There's another one that's coming down the pike, and once again, it's all takes place in the Midwest, and it's about really, really sort of complex characters. And I think there are certain writers that you find your thing that you're really good at writing. And for me, it's I know I'm good at writing sort of the complexity of the Midwest. So if you're interested in that, Still the Night Call, Heaven and Earth, that's my that's going to be my jam. I'll always write my Desperate Housewives, sort of L Word, suburban women sort of shows. But I think that for whenever I get to sort of the heart of who I am as a writer, and when I'm alone in a room, I like to sort of dive into the psychology of where I came from, because I think it's healing, and I hope that it will help heal, people who read my work.
Well, I think it will, and I think it's truly you're shining a light on you're shining a light for people who uh, may not necessarily understand or have tried to understand another kind of aspect or component from a different side, and I think it's great. So,
Thank you.
um,
Thank you.
thank you so much for sitting down. This was great. I really appreciate it. Again, guys, this comes out next week, Heaven and Earth, the 15th of May.
Monday.
Monday, you can get it from all the
You can
places.
order anywhere, and it's on. We got Kindle, we got Amazon, we got Nook, we got all of those. So however you like to read it, just read it, and please leave a review for me on Goodreads or Amazon. Mostly if you just like the book. If you don't, no,
Then don't worry
but
about it.
like that's always so meaningful, So anyway, and thank
All
you
right.
for.
Well, thank you so much. And we'll talk soon.
All right.